IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat. You're listening to All Things Policy. I'm Aditya Pareek, and today I have with me our old friend, Pranav Satyanath. Pranav, as longtime listeners of this podcast will know, is an alumnus of the Takshashila Institution and had a key role in making All Things Policy happen. Welcome, Pranav.
Thank you, Aditya. That's a very kind thing to say.
Quick disclaimer, folks. It is important to acknowledge that the situation is extremely fluid right now, and in some days may well be that things we discuss today may become outdated by the time this episode is published. But regardless, as a Russia watcher, it is important for us to tackle a topical issue for our listeners. Now, hostilities are raging in Ukraine as of this morning on 1st March when we are recording. There have been talks between the Russian and Ukrainian side, but a diplomatic solution has yet to be seen emerging. On the 22nd of February, Moscow recognized the breakaway separatist Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics in the Donbas region of Ukraine as independent republics. And then they launched what Moscow calls a special military operation on the 24th against Ukraine. Now, there's a lot of fog of war, but in this episode, we'll do our best to discuss some aspects of the ongoing conflict. So to start with, Pranav, what's your bird's eye view of the situation, the conflict and its impact on the wider world and Russia and Ukraine themselves?
So firstly, let me say that I'm not a Russian military expert. I study military operations and I watch how militaries fight very closely. So this is of particular interest to everyone who studies military operations and international politics. But we have to acknowledge that this is an extraordinary situation that we're seeing develop within a course of a month. Most of us were hoping and certainly anticipating that the build-up on around the three sides of Ukraine would certainly be a way of signaling and a way of coercion to get extractions on the negotiating table. However, this has been a full-fledged invasion. Russia has invaded Ukraine from the east, from the south, and from the north as well. And that is a quite important aspect. Let me just focus on what are the military aspects of this rather than some of the international aspects. What I find very surprising is that the Russian military forces hope to gain a quick and decisive victory, particularly when they moved their forces from Belarus through Chernobyl and to take Kiev. What I was particularly surprised about is that in the first and second days of the invasion itself, we saw Russians use their long-range cruise missile capabilities and as well as their heliborne and paratroopers towards Kiev. However, what they didn't anticipate was the level of resistance they would be getting from in and around Kiev itself, which has become the focal point on what is now the fifth day of the invasion. The Russians, particularly from some of the leaked statements or from some of the leaked articles, they'd hoped for a quick and decisive victory, such that they had estimated that the Ukrainians would surrender quite easily and certainly negotiate on Russian terms. However, this has not happened. The support from the European countries has gone up. We have seen countries like Finland supply the Ukrainian forces with advanced anti-tank capabilities and anti-aircraft capabilities. And this is certainly going to increase over the next coming days. The wider impact, as you have written and as people generally know, is that Russia is now under heavy sanctions. Even a neutral country like Switzerland is imposing sanctions and cutting off Russia from its foreign assets. The ruble has gone down over 40%. And this has had an extremely heavy impact on the Russian economy itself. By all means, this is a very, in one bird's eye view, as you say, in a very broad view, it's once again, we are reminded of how war has so much uncertainty to. Particularly, I'm reminded of the book from Jeffrey Blaney's book, Causes of War, where he says that leaders throughout history go to war thinking they can win decisive victories. However, these leaders grossly overestimate their own capabilities and the capabilities of their enemy, and therefore they end up losing wars. This happens to be a classic case, even though I'm calling early shots. In the first 5 days of this invasion, this seems to be the case that Vladimir Putin and the Russian forces in general have underestimated the human factor of the Ukrainian people, which is their threshold to resist and which is their threshold to not surrender. And certainly, a lot of this also depends on the support that the Ukrainian forces have been getting from foreign powers, particularly countries like Finland, which have been supplying the Ukrainian forces with advanced anti tank and anti aircraft capabilities. What we can take away in a broader picture is that despite what we see on paper, that the Russian army is, as people commonly say, that it's an artillery force, and it certainly is, because the Russian doctrine depends on suppressive fire in early days of conflict, and it depends on electronic warfare and electronic jamming capabilities. Despite having the best of technologies, you still have to face the fog of war. One of the things that people have been wondering is why Russia has not used its jamming and electronic warfare capabilities. One of the interesting points is that, especially in urban environment, using electronic jamming capabilities not only jams your enemies' radars and tracking capabilities, but it also jams your own. Technology does not discriminate because you're using similar frequencies. So jamming capabilities are particularly of limited use in an urban environment. And in an urban environment, you're more vulnerable, especially if you're using armored forces. In a city covered with buildings, it's easy for your enemies to attack you from different directions. It's easy for them to place mines in an urban environment, and they're able to camouflage these quite easily. And these are all lessons that are not new. These are from history. That is perhaps the biggest lesson that we can take away, is that it is still possible, even with the best intelligence capability, still possible to underestimate what your enemies are capable of and what is their threshold to surrender.
Indeed, and just a little bit to add, I think the sanctions and the export controls which have come in, so from the Western nations and their allies in the Asia Pacific, for example, Japan, which was very reluctant to sanction Russia at one point, but then progressively they've complied with the demands of their G7 partners to be close in step in trying to give a response to Russia on the events of these recent days. So I think the geoeconomics aspect of it, which you've briefly covered in your answer just now. So I think it's a bit of projecting where Russia's fortunes and power would come from in the future, and as much as it's about just seeing the events unfold. So as you mentioned that 40% of the ruble's value crashed in a single day, that's something devastating, but it's not really the full impact of the economic hardship that seems to be in the offing as of yet, because the stock exchange just didn't open, and as far as I understand won't be open until the 5th of March. And so we would see the actual downturn only going forward, and the kind of sanctions, especially the export controls on high-tech components. Well, as far as I understand, the Western countries haven't limited Russia's populations access to everyday gadgets like smartphones, etc., but rather they've hit to the industrial aspects of Russia's economy. So semiconductors meant for servers, meant for industrial applications, the arms industry, they have been curtailed. But to stuff that goes into your smartphone or your laptop, I don't think they are on the horizon for being controlled for export to Russia right now. So it's really about hurting the government and its military potential rather than hurting and alienating the populace of Russia. This is how the West is seeing this conflict, even with sanctions. But in the end, if a hyperinflation happens, if a general state of economic downturn happens, the lives of common everyday Russians are going to be affected anyway. And this might not exactly work out the way the West might have thought. So I think we are heading from a bird's eye perspective, so to say, towards a more polarized populace on both sides, because, in the West, you see people demanding, and even before the conflict started, before any troops crossed any border, there were calls for preemptive sanctions. Even Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky even asked for preemptive sanctions. And at the time, I was of the opinion that if anything's going to push President Putin to conduct a military operation to order the troops to actually cross the border, this is going to be it. Because at that point, the person who's in the decision maker's chair, he has really nothing to lose. At that point, the calculation becomes that what do we have to show for all this pain that has been inflicted on us? So that kind of a situation, even during the brief 1.5 or 2 days between the recognition of the breakaway republics from Ukraine versus the actual military operation, that brief period, I think there was some discourse inside Russia and outside Russia about this.
Certainly. Thank you for adding the economic aspects, which I totally, completely forgot to add, or because I don't follow it that closely. But what is interesting for me is that it's an unintended consequences, right? The Russian billionaires and the business people, and certainly most of the big industries, obviously saw the domestic financial system as a risk, and what they sought to do was divert their assets and move their assets to foreign countries. And this put them in a deadlock, because the international political risk, of course, was that if Russia does something as dramatic as invade a sovereign territory, then these assets would certainly be on the table to be cut off. And that has certainly happened to a very, very large extent. And which is the unintended consequences of doing business, because you're facing risk domestically, but also there is also a certain level of risk at the international political level, and the business people who at the end of the day want to secure their businesses have no way of knowing what political actions will trigger international sanctions or international responses. And ultimately, I think you might agree with me that the way things have turned out in the past 5 days is such that it's not only the Russian government that's being hurt, but it's also indirectly the Russian people. And Russia has been stuck in a way of the worst of both worlds. They aren't able to achieve the military objectives on the battlefield itself, and they aren't able to get their way on the negotiating table or at the international political level, because it seems that even India is hedging its way towards supporting Ukraine in a very incremental level. As I mentioned, even Switzerland, a country that has maintained neutrality, has imposed sanctions on Russia. So it's very early to say this, but I believe that over the coming days, it might be a sign of desperation when the Russian forces will truly increase their presence, and this will become a large-scale operation rather than a small-scale operation.
Indeed, I agree. And I think the most pain would be inflicted by the prospective sanctions on the Central Bank of Russia and DeSWIFTing Russia, upon which many people from Takshashila Institution have actually weighed in, and would link all the articles that were published on the subject recently in the show notes. So moving on, there's this expression that's been used, fog of war, by both of us. Now, the information domain's importance in this conflict has been paramount.
Yes.
Let's discuss some notable developments concerning it over the past few days.
The notable developments is that if you generally look at the Western analysis of how the Russian military doctrine will play out, it's usually in the context of a Russian invasion in the Baltics. And the anticipation is that the Russian would use the vast open fields to invade. And when you have vast open fields and little in the way of an urban environment and a target-rich environment that is NATO forces, you would have a lot of electronic assets to jam. You would have a lot of intelligence gathering to do. You would have a lot of target-rich environments in an open field. But when you're talking about an urban environment, you can target airfields, you can target checkposts. But the main thrust of the offensive has to come when you have to invade the city itself, such as Kiev, which is a large city and a very, very urban environment. And this is where the fog of war really comes in. The fog of war is generally that you cannot, and your military forces do not have perfect information. As the Clausewitz would call it, simple things like a tree falling down and your troops getting stuck. In the modern day battlefield, it's you're running out of fuel and you don't know when your logistics are going to come back, because your logistics column behind the flank is probably stuck because of the enemy suppressive fires. These are the fog of war, which I believe are generally taken into account. No modern military fighting force will conduct such an operation without taking these factors into account. But what is still very surprising is that the degree of uncertainty also depends on variables such as the foreign support that we've again previously spoken so much of.
Pranav, I think from Informatsnije Vojna, we've somehow gone to Gibridnaya Vojna. So from information war, we've transitioned straight from the start to hybrid warfare. So can you give us a little bit about the Ghost of Kiev, for example, or the way President Zelensky has been presenting himself?
I don't really know about the Ghost of Kiev because war always tends to, conflict in general tends to, these are stories that are very popular in the folklore of conflict and war. I would refrain from commenting from such things, although it's nice to see them on the internet. President Zelensky has certainly caught the eye of everyone. Conversations at home, people who barely knew where Ukraine was are now talking about how the president was a comedian and he's risen up to the challenge and become a real war hero, in the sense that he has decided, and phrases like I don't need an airlift, I need ammunition, have certainly been excellent PR taglines. I'm sure that some of the best advertising firms would pick up on these taglines and try to do something with them. In this sense, it has been phenomenal for the Ukrainian people because, in general, as a humanitarian effort, I don't think anyone would support an invasion as such. But the President Zelensky's presentation of himself as a person with the people has certainly stoked the imagination of the ideal war leader.
Agreed. And just to add, I think President Zelensky has been more capable of convincing the wider world of the way his country is, allegedly fighting an aggressive force. And he's been able to, present the Russians as the aggressor and the party in the wrong. And I think that is a very strategic objective that's been achieved. And as we previously discussed in this episode, that even neutral nations who were hesitant, including Finland, which, Finlandization is a term which, reflects concept in IR today. But it's increasingly losing its value as we speak. And even Finland is now looking at NATO membership. So the signaling and the convincing part of his, war by other means, Zelensky's war by other means, is pretty successful because he's managed to, as he calls it, the international coalition against military aggression or something like that he calls it. So he's been able to fight the war on the diplomatic front, in the sense that he's talking to other parties in the conflict which are not directly belligerents but can exert a lot of influence through their economic, and by just lending the military technical means, the NLAWs and the other air defense systems and anti-tank systems that are being supplied to Ukraine right now. So he's been able to convince a lot of folks, and it comes kind of as ironic because the way before this conflict actually broke out, and really it's a matter of when do you start counting the conflict as having been begun. So does it start in April 2021, or does it start in October 2021, or does it start on the 23rd or 24th of February 2022? So it really is about the past few months, intelligence of the Western security apparatus, the UK and the US, declassifying and broadcasting to the whole world what the Russian plans might be for an invasion or an offensive war. Well, some of it did indeed come true. And I think the lost reputation over stuff like WMDs in Iraq and all, well, they finally managed to put an end to that narrative. So the information warfare domain, I think, has never been as lively as it is in this current conflict.
I would agree with you, but I think more generally, where I would refrain from placing too much emphasis on the information domain, is still that you need the physical warfighting operational capabilities to achieve your objectives. You can have the best of information campaigns, you can have everyone against you, and still you could achieve a swift and decisive victory. The real failure for me here is the actual military capabilities that have failed to achieve their objectives. It's either that Vladimir Putin had set a very, very high bar for the military to achieve with very, very limited forces, or that there has been a complete disconnect between what the objectives that are supposed to be achieved or what is the commitment that the military forces are able to give to achieve those objectives. So it's either of the two. Geoeconomics has a very, very big role to play in this, but the way it would affect a country like Russia would not be in a matter of weeks, it would be in a matter of weeks and months. So if Russia had managed to achieve a decisive victory within, say, a week, within 4 or 5 days, then probably the outcome would have been that Russia would have been able to impose its will on the Ukrainians and on the West itself through sheer military power. And a negotiation would have taken place on the Russian turf. I'm still of the belief that your hard power, your military capabilities, your operational planning are still paramount, despite all the strides that Russia and every other country has made in the information domain, in the cyber domain, and the social media campaigns, and so on.
Well, I partly agree, because any victory that Russia would have achieved in this campaign or would achieve in this campaign, I think it would be Pyrrhic because of the geoeconomics, bearing down on Russia's economy and weakening it at home. So I don't really see Russia actually getting favorable terms post to conflict, because even if it meets its military objectives, the overall prosperity of its nation is really something that's been threatened. And when the whole international community led by the G7 is pretty much ganging up on Russia, it really is very hard for Russia to sustain, because at the end of the day, it has a few nations abstaining against it for very diplomatic and self-interest kind of reasons. And then it has China, which is as of now very hesitant to completely commit to a bloc with Russia. And even if such a bloc were to be there, Russia has very little leverage in shaping the policy for that bloc were it to emerge. So, there's no two ways about it, but Russia is not in a very strong position. And even if it meets its military objectives, even if it had met its military objectives, say, on the very first day of the war and then withdrawn forces, I don't really think the situation would have ended very favorably for Russia, because, as far as I see it, be it whatever domain, the only winning play in this situation was not to play at all, but to coerce by building up the forces on the border and keeping the pressure on until the diplomatic objectives were achieved. But since we are in the fray now, it really is just in hindsight.
I mean, certainly, I wasn't trying to suggest that Russia would get an extremely favorable terms. They would have certainly been worse off, but they wouldn't have been in the worst possible position that they have sort of got themselves into right now. And I catch the reference of a cultural reference there. You said only winning move is not to play. I'm always reminded of the movie War Games when such a phrase comes up, and it certainly holds true here.
On that note, folks, we'll take a short break.
Hello. It's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Advertising is Dead, Varun is joined by Anupam Gurani, the Chief Marketing Officer for LEAD. He breaks down the school edtech sector for us. On The Longest Constitution, Priya delves into intellectual property rights and the sexual reproductive autonomy of women. On Press Decode, Sarah Vagda and Prafula engage in a debate on representation and discuss how we see race and religion. On Say No to Drama, Chitna slices through the drama around fights in relationships and how long they should last. Is it immoral to have feelings for someone else after you're happily married? On Hans Vani, here's the story Tasavvur-e-Jana about a woman's dilemma with love. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. It really helps us. Don't forget to rate us on any of the platforms that you're listening to. And also remember, you can check us out on YouTube at www.ivmpodcast.com/YouTube. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week, SBI Life Insurance, Bank of Baroda, and HDFC Life Insurance. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Welcome back, folks. We're discussing the conflict in Ukraine. So moving on, let's talk about the nuclear aspect. So firstly, what kind of nuclear signaling is in play by Russia, and what kind of long-range fires and platforms the Russian military have deployed in this conflict? Can you give us a bird's eye view of that?
Yeah, before I speak about the specifics of the signaling aspect, when Russia was preparing for the invasion, many experts generally said that this is not a conflict with a nuclear element. I would sharply disagree with them because nuclear weapons in general shape the geopolitics and foreign policy of a country. With respect to whether a country is using nuclear weapons or not, the presence of nuclear weapons itself creates certain dynamics that are very, very different from a state that does not have nuclear weapons, right? So no matter what conflict is there in any country with nuclear weapons that goes into conflict is always under the nuclear umbrella. Nuclear politics is all about how your nuclear weapons shapes your foreign policy. It can, for a country like Russia, having nuclear weapons itself can give it the precedence to conduct conventional operations such as what we've seen now, which is what is known as the stability-instability paradox, where you have stability at the nuclear level, where no two countries are firing nuclear weapons at each other, but you have instability at the lower levels, where countries have a greater freedom of movement to conduct conventional military operations. We've seen that with India and Pakistan quite a lot because experts around the world have been referring to Pakistan's subconventional capabilities and India's relatively limited use of conventional warfare. But what we're seeing now is a much more pronounced version of the stability-instability paradox. With that, let me come to the more specific aspects of Russian military forces. The Russian military forces is by and large focused on the land-based aspect of the triad. Russia has ICBMs, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and bombers. But a bulk of the warheads are actually focused on a land-based capabilities, where Russia depends on the SS-18 ICBMs, the Yars mobile and silo-based ICBMs, and the newer Sarmat ICBM. This makes up the bulk of the Russian strategic forces on the land-based side. Russia has at least 2 submarine-launched ballistic missile types that are in operation, and the Russians operate the Tu-95 Bear and the Tu-160 Blackjack as their strategic bomber force. So these are the 3 aspects of the Russian triad. And there is a focus also on the Russian non-strategic capabilities, which are warheads of very small yield, which is below 1 kiloton or below 10 kilotons. And this is largely focused on their land-based shorter-range missiles, as well as the surface ships on which they have cruise missiles armed with nuclear warheads. That's, in a very short way, a summarization of the Russian nuclear forces.
Thanks for that, Pranav. And we'll move on. So how would this war have an impact on India? How does it look for India's POV? Let's start with you, then I'll weigh in.
You are in a better position to explain this than I am because you watch Russia more closely. But my general take is that in the long term, this would deeply hurt India's capabilities, India's position to acquire military capabilities from Russia, right? There are still contracts and agreements that are unfulfilled and which are still being undertaken. It shows that when a country like India, which has quoted figure 70% of its military capabilities are dependent on a country like Russia, a dramatic geopolitical event can seriously shake up India's modernization efforts for the future. In the long, it's very difficult for me to say in the long term because India has taken very, very cautious attempts to hedge its way throughout the situation. The spokesperson for the White House himself acknowledged that India has a special relationship with Russia and the Americans understand this position. But if this invasion prolongs in such a way that it is a serious cause for concern and not only a humanitarian one, then India would be forced to take a position against Russia and cut off part of Russian investment from India itself. But I haven't analyzed this aspect more closely, so I would refrain from commenting even more.
Okay, so for me, I think it would be wise to say that India is, more about investing in Russia's Far East, as Prime Minister Modi has always said. So our idea with investing with Russia was always about the territory that has to be developed not the European part of Russia that much. Although we're also part of Russia's cooperation in the IT sphere and all. But our main investment was always about, transshipment, hydrocarbons, just the overall infrastructure development of the Russian Far East. So I think our strategic priority was long-term with Russia. And for the short term, we were just thinking of the military, industrial, technological cooperation and simply put, buying arms from Russia. So I think that cooperation would still continue. But I think New Delhi has been put in a very tightrope kind of a situation where it has to balance both sides of this conflict. And I'm not even talking about NATO, I'm talking about Russia and Ukraine. Because India, believe it or not, also depends on Ukraine for a lot of components in the very same military hardware that it's buying from Moscow. Say, for example, a lot of gas turbines, the engines of Indian Navy warships that we're so proud of seeing in our fleet actually depend on Ukraine. They are Ukrainian manufactured, and say, for example, the latest class of frigates that's being built in Russia right now, they received Ukrainian engines, and those engines have been put in those hulls that the Russian shipyards are building. Despite the conflict, we have to balance both sides. And one notable part, so ISRO has been pride point for our nation, and it also depends on Ukraine. So, for example, the semi-cryogenic engine for our space program is based on the Ukrainian supplied RD-810 designs that we got from the Ukrainians. So I think we're also looking for testing that hardware in Ukrainian facilities for it to be certified and eventually put into operation. So I think Ukraine's cooperation is just as much, if not equally important for our military and as well as our high-tech sectors like outer space.
Yeah, certainly. Actually, it's not been discussed quite often on social media or by the expert community, but Ukraine is actually one of the leading countries in manufacturing of high-tech turbines and rocket engines, to the extent that Russia, the most recent part of the last decade, was dependent on Ukraine for supplying of its engines, because after the Soviet Union broke up, many of the factories and many of the engineering capabilities were in Ukraine itself. And it's mostly recently that Russia has ramped up its domestic manufacturing and design efforts so that they're self-sustaining. Yeah, Ukraine has a high-tech element to it, which is quite easily forgotten.
Indeed. And on that note, folks, we'll call it a wrap. If you like today's discussion, please do check out all past and future episodes of All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
जिस तरीके से हमारे माँ बाप ने अपने करियर की सीढ़ियाँ चढ़ी थी, वैसे आज के जमाने में तो पॉसिबल है ही नहीं गुरु, क्योंकि हमारा जमाना इतना कॉम्प्लिकेटेड है। आज क्या नहीं है, कंपटीशन है, सोशल मीडिया है, इतना इंफॉर्मेशन ओवरलोड है कि करियर का टेंशन ज्यादा होता है, उस पर काम कम। टेंशन लेने से कोई फायदा तो है नहीं। क्या करते हैं, ठंडे दिमाग से सुनते हैं प्रोबेशन से प्रमोशन तक पॉडकास्ट को हर सोमवार, जहाँ पे सिर्फ प्रैक्टिकल बातें होती हैं आपके करियर की। और कौन करता है वो? मैं आपका होस्ट अभिनव त्रिवेदी। ये पॉडकास्ट आप सुन सकते हैं IVM पॉडकास्ट की वेबसाइट, ऐप या फिर किसी भी अन्य पॉडकास्ट स्ट्रीमिंग प्लेटफॉर्म पर।
You're the people pleaser, right? Oh, yes. Or then desperately seeking the one? Oh, wait, you're the one who doesn't think they're ever good enough. Oh. So much drama. And for what? Is it doing you any good? Listen to me. I'm Chetna, your favorite positive action coach. Yes, I'm the one who has been dropping all those truth bombs on every episode. Oh, no. And it's time you learn to say no to drama. That's also what my podcast is called. And a new episode is out every Monday and Wednesday on the IVM Podcast app, website, as well as all major podcasting platforms.